Hi, and welcome to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly show about finance, money, and investing. I'm your host, Ray Treverson from OTG Capital. This show is broadcast locally on Radio Northern Beaches and around Australia on the Community Radio Network. Always a pleasure to have industry experts, but this week, something a little different. We have a volunteer that is joining us from the Australian Shareholders Association. Welcome, Peter Gregory.
Hi, Ray. Great to be with you.
Wonderful. Now, Peter Gregory, you've come highly recommended to me because Keith Reedy, who is the person that I know through ASA, through monthly investor discussion groups, said to me, Ray, you really need to interview Peter Gregory because he's probably one of our best monitors around. And so before we get too much deeper, I wanted to maybe just delve back a little bit and talk a little bit about you and your association with the ASA. How long have you been in the Shareholders Association?
Look, I joined when I was when I retired. I guess up until then I hadn't really had much time to be involved in things other than work and other interests. But when I retired, I started to build a pile of investments and joined the ASA as a means of education and getting to meet with other people who were doing like kind of things.
Right. It's a kind of interesting volunteer association because it's the first one that I've been involved in that doesn't involve barbecuing sausages. And so I've done a lot of volunteering with my high schools and my primary schools. I did a bit of lifeline work. I like the idea of community work. But I must say, the volunteers that I see at ASA, you're doing a very different kind of public service in my view, because my radio show and YouTube channel is all about financial education. And I think that's the big remit within ASA, isn't it?
Yeah, ASA is really about representing individual shareholders. And when you think about it, the companies that so many of us choose to invest in, they hear a lot from the proxy advisors, they hear a lot from the institutional investors and the super funds. But in terms of understanding who individual investors are and what their needs are, Australian Shareholders Association is the only contact they really have.
Mm.
And we have a very clearly set out set of guidelines that we want companies to understand and work with, so that individual shareholders get what they need out of companies, as well as delivering for the major shareholders.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, I started getting involved when I retrained out of IT into finance. I did my financial planning thing and I got qualified, and I went along to the Australian Investors Association many years ago. And how funny how things go full circle. But AIA is now a part of the ASA, and we're not going to talk about that today. I want to get Rachel Waterhouse, the CEO, to talk a little bit about that. But again, we're talking about like-minded themes where people get together, talk about investments, talk about how to better do finance and I guess retire in comfort. And so let's talk a little bit about what you do in monitoring. Can you tell the audience what a monitor is?
A monitor is someone who and each of us are assigned or choose to work with a number of companies. In my case, it's 5, where we have the opportunity usually to meet with the company chair or chair of the remuneration committee prior to their AGM, and about what it is that individual shareholders want to see companies do. And I guess bear in mind that a big difference between individual shareholders and institutional shareholders is we tend to be fairly long-term investors. We're pretty loyal to the companies we choose to invest in, so we want to see that they've got good outcomes for the long haul. Whereas the bigger investors, usually they're looking at sort of this year, next year. So our focus is very different. And we work through a process of talking with the companies about what it is individual investors are looking for. We prepare what we refer to as our voting intentions, which are how we suggest our members vote at the AGM, or as proxies if they choose to vote that way. And then we go to the AGM and we'll ask questions of the chair and management of things that we think are pertinent to the needs of individual shareholders. And then we write a brief summary of the outcome of the AGM. So it's like every individual shareholder can participate in the process, even though it's through a monitor who's working it for them.
Right. And again, one of the things that I try and do on the show is demystify a little bit of jargon just in case. So can you explain to the listeners what a proxy is, please?
A proxy is where a shareholder assigns to someone else the ability to vote on their behalf. So we ask our members or suggest to our members that they assign the proxies to ASA, so that when we go to an AGM, we can stand up and say, well, in this particular company, we are representing the interests of 1,000 shareholders, representing 20-30 million dollars worth of shares. So
Right.
it gives ASA a lot of credibility, and it means that I think we gain a lot of respect from the companies that we work with. They listen to us. They don't always agree, but they certainly take notice, and appreciate the fact that they're hearing from individual shareholders en masse.
I think it reminds me of that wonderful that wonderful quote from a previous US president, Richard Nixon: "Speak softly, but carry a big stick." I think is the term that's attributed to Tricky Dicky. But I think when you're able to turn up to an AGM and you are representing that many shareholders and a decent swag of the registry, that people will notice.
I think that's right, and I think the speak softly is a very important point, because we want to treat these very senior business people we're dealing with very respectfully. We'll put our point of view, we'll back it up as much as we can with facts, and ask that we be heard. There's no sort of stumping on the table or making demands. It's a very respectful and open and clear discussion where we both understand our points of view and either move forward or agree.
I guess one of the things that I'd really like to paint the picture and get some context then, because the thing that people might see when people are turning up to AGMs are activist shareholders, or what some CEOs might just refer to as just downright troublemakers and ratbags. That's really not what we're talking about, are we?
Absolutely not. We're very open and very engaging with the companies. We share with them a document that's called our voting guidelines, where we very clearly outlay what it is that we're looking for, and they're very reasonable kind of expectations. And just one thing I'd say is that these guidelines mean that we're dealing with all companies consistently. No one's getting treated any differently. That we ask them all to deliver in the same kind of respect that is to the benefit of a host of individual shareholders. We're certainly not activists. We don't have a particular barrow to push. We just present the case for the individual shareholder cohort, and ask the companies to take that into account.
So you're not turning up to meetings with torches and pitchforks.
That would be a terrifying thing to do, right?
Okay, so
We never
on
do
my notes,
anything that would land us in jail.
so on my notes here, I notice you monitor ASX, Ramsay Healthcare, Cube Logistics, Soul Patts, and Lendlease. These are pretty big companies that you're looking after on behalf of ASA. I guess the big question I've got, given when you retire, I often hear people that retire, they comment, "I'm busier now than when I was working." I mean, doing all this monitoring, it sounds like you're pretty busy. What made you want to become a monitor?
Look, there's a particular time of year that goes from about August through to November where I'm extremely busy. But in terms of what makes me want to do it, when I first started getting involved in investing, when I retired, I started going along to AGMs. I started doing research, reading annual reports, and asking questions. And I found it particularly interesting from my point of view to hear the answers. I found it really good to be able to talk to the CEO and CFO and directors over the coffee break after the meeting. And I really enjoyed engaging with those people and understanding more about the companies I was invested in, so that I was confident that I was making good or perhaps not so good investment decisions when I put my money with them.
So I'm curious then, with the companies that we've just mentioned, do you actually invest in them as well as monitor?
I'm not invested in all of them, but most of them I am, yes.
Okay, curious. Okay, that's good, because I guess one of the things that I'm not a huge equities player, by the way, Peter, and I think by way of declaring my interests, I'm awful at, at investing in equities. I say this often when I go to the ASA meetings. I'm a bonds kind of guy, and I actually run I'm a funds manager, and I run a bond organization, and so I get that. I understand that a lot better, and so I'm always getting pinged by my SMSF auditor because they keep on saying, you only do bonds, you need to do other things. And I say, yeah, but this is what I understand. I don't understand equities. I guess along the journey that you've been a monitor, you have obviously learned a lot more about investing in shares, haven't you?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I do it, in that it's been a particularly good learning experience for me, both in terms of understanding what's behind the company, but also the discipline of going through the company documents and thinking through how I should be voting in terms of companies I'm invested in on my own right, and also in terms of thinking about how I recommend our members involved as shareholders vote their proxies.
It's quite a responsibility when you think about it. It's not just the number of shares, but we're also talking about a lot of people who, I think there's a huge trust bond that we're talking about here as well, that you're turning up with your proxies in your back pocket. And there's a lot of people that are looking to you to say, Peter, go in and represent our best interests. And so I'm finding it fascinating that it's just a volunteer role, because, man, there's a lot of heavy duty. There's big bricks on. There's big weight on your shoulders there, I'd suggest.
And I certainly do feel that at times, but I guess I have some confidence in what I'm doing is, and I mentioned the guidelines before. They are guidelines. They're not sort of rules put in place, but I work around the guidelines that have been put in place by a bunch of people who are far smarter than I am. And I know that the members of ASA who assign proxies trust that all of the monitors are going to work within the set of framework that ASA has in place. So yeah, you feel the burden of the responsibility when you stand up and you say, "Hi, I'm Peter Gregory from the Australian Shareholders Association. We're a volunteer organisation that represents the needs of individual shareholders, and today I'm representing X amount of shares to this value." You think, "Oh wow."
Well, look, we're just about at time for a break, Peter. You're here on Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly show about finance, money, and investing. I'm your host, Ray Treverson. It's time for a short break. We'll be back in just a moment. Hi, and thank you for listening to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly radio program about finance, money, and investing on Radio Northern Beaches and nationally on the Community Radio Network around Australia. The views, comments, and opinions aired during our program should not be construed or viewed as financial advice. Any commentary is general advice only and does not take into account your objectives, financial situation, or needs. You should consider whether the advice is suitable for you and your personal circumstances. If in doubt, you should contact an authorised licensed financial planner. We welcome questions and feedback, and you can get in touch with us via our blog, social media channels, or email. Please search for Dollars and Making Sense in your favourite podcast platform, or check out our blog at otgcapital.com.au/blog. Hi, and welcome back. You're listening to Dollars and Making Sense, a weekly show about finance, money, and investing. I'm your host, Ray Treverson. At the microphone this week, we have Peter Gregory, who is a monitor and volunteer with the Australian Shareholders Association. Peter, before we went to the break, we were talking about monitoring, about what you've been doing in the companies that you do monitor. I wanted to, in the second half of the show, maybe do a bit of a deep dive now into the real gem, the work that you and all other monitors for the ASA produce, and that's the voting intentions. So before you get to the actual written document, what kind of preparation do you do as a monitor to start looking at this voting intention document?
Ray, there are key things, three key things. One is, of course, the annual report and notice of meeting that goes with that to research the information that's in there. The second is sort of due diligence, you might call it, where we look at other information that's available for the company, whether it's reported in the news. We also look through their recent ASX announcements to see if there's information in there that's of value. But the really important part of it is what we refer to as the pre-AGM meeting, where we sit down with the chairman of the board, usually the chair of the remuneration committee, the investor relations manager, and sometimes one or two other senior managers in the organisation. And we have a very open conversation about what it is individual shareholders are looking for, and gaps that we see that the company has, and talk through what ASA would like to see them modify. We then, following the pre-AGM meeting, we write down our set of voting intentions, which is, as we say, we outline how ASA is going to vote proxies that are undirected. We also regard it as guidance for individuals who don't give us proxies to use in determining how they vote. At the start of the voting intentions, as I said, there's the how we intend to vote each resolution. There's also sort of 2 or 3 key points that we think are relevant in terms of this company, and that really is the crux. If you don't read the whole voting intentions, certainly read those 2 or 3 points that tell you what are the key things that we're going to bring up at the AGM, and then we go into some specific detail. We don't want to repeat necessarily what's in the annual report, but we want to give our interpretation of what's there, and to provide shareholders that's information that's useful to them in understanding what the things that are important from individual shareholders' point of view. There are 2 things that are in every AGM, and that's the directors' re-election and remuneration report. So there's always a particular focus on those 2 things in the voting intentions. And we go into a little more detail on those into general things. But voting intentions are on the ASA website. They're easy to find if you just click on the historic voting intentions. It gives you the current voting intentions, and you can also look at what's been covered in the last couple of years also in terms of voting intentions.
I guess I'm fascinated because I haven't worked in too many public companies, and the public companies that I have worked in for were American IT companies, and their idea of engaging with shareholders, they just would have laughed. The idea that you'd actually talk to people that own stock. It's like, guys, you own it, and if you don't like it, sell it. They're pretty up and down about that whole situation, and so I'm curious so you've got a list of questions, or when you're turning up to meet and do this pre-meeting, do you give them forewarning of what you're looking for? Because again, you've got skills that not everybody will have. I mean, reading an annual report is a skill. Being able to interpret a chart of accounts, I think is a real fine skill to be able to have, because everybody looks for different things. And so I guess as a monitor, are there specific things that you are looking for when you're looking at a chart of accounts of a listed company?
I guess when I look at accounts of a listed company, I mean, I step back from the thing and say, well, this has been audited. So there's a fair degree of confidence that the information that's in the accounts is correct and is compliant with the standards that are in place. The thing that I'm more inclined to look at is those areas where directors have some discretion, and that applies to particularly to valuations, whether it's assets or particularly intangibles. Goodwill in particular is an area that I'm interested in.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
Or valuation of things like intellectual property. So that's an area where there is discretion and where it's appropriate, I think, to be asking questions. I'll also look at the key audit matters, because that's the document where the auditor has flagged things that they thought were particularly pertinent for this company. And at the pre-AGM meeting, I'll ask questions relating to those things. And just from scanning through the annual report, and I've got to say, I'm not an accountant. I've, through most of my working life, been measured by things that are in financial reports, but I have no idea.
Likewise.
I don't know how to put them together, but I'll scan through them and look for things that I just don't think are quite right. In particular, look at things of what's changed between this year and last year and the year before, because that's kind of flagging that a change is always something to question.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I must admit, just as an aside, Peter, one of the things that when I was evaluating technology companies, for example, and I come from a telco background, so back in the old days when we still used to make phone calls and internet service providers, the big key to success or failure of telcos in that day and probably still today is, can you collect money? And so my big thing I'd always be looking through chart of accounts was receivables. Now, how far out are their receivables? Are they collecting their money? Can they bill their money? Services companies are no different. So when the big consulting firms, if they've got big receivables, that means they can't bill. And so if they're not billing well, that means they're not collecting. And so therefore I'm sitting there going, I'm not so sure about those revenue numbers because they could be a little soft if they're not collecting. So that's a simple thing that I look at. Is there a favorite thing that you look at?
As I mentioned before, the intangibles, the things that they're valuing. Also look at receivables too, because if they're not collecting money, as you say, there's a real problem. Look at inventory to see, because if inventory is building, is that because they're not selling enough or they're buying too much or whatever? It's I guess the working capital items that you want to look at to see what's changing.
So can you maybe enlighten the listeners, maybe some memorable moments, maybe good or bad, I don't know. What sticks in your mind when you've turned up for an AGM and you're thinking to yourself at the end of it, man, I'm not going to forget today for a while?
I got to say that I haven't had what I would call bad experiences.
Good, that's good.
There've been experiences that have been challenging, where I've put to boards and management things that perhaps they didn't really want to be asked about. But that's okay, as long as you're supported with the right processes, and as long as you're supported with facts, it's okay to ask those things. Good experiences. I've had some pretty positive responses to questions. I think at times I've been able to elicit things from companies that I think are important for shareholders to know that they haven't brought out through the formal presentation or other questions. And often that's a case of the extent to which management is actively involved in the day-to-day of the business, or are they just sitting in their ivory tower? Do boards, when they have meetings, go out to locations where companies are meeting? Those kind of things to me indicate connection within the organisation, between the leadership of the organisation and the company. And the people actually doing the job in the company. That's really important. Says a bit to the culture of the organisation.
Well, certainly, one of the things that I think many listeners and viewers out in the world today would have seen the ASA quite mobile and quite active was when Rachel Waterhouse, the CEO of ASA, was getting quite well engaged on the Qantas front with much of the public flailing that they so richly deserved, and so certainly the monitor there was earning their money well and truly over time. And I think that's one of the valuable assets that I want to encourage listeners out there. If you are not a member of the ASA today, the membership fees are not huge by any stretch. Peter, I know from you and certainly from Keith Reedy, whom I see regularly at the Mossman discussion groups, the kind of value that you get out of reading the voting intentions is second to none. And if you are investing in equities, ladies and gents, this is a valuable resource, a yearly membership that gives you access to these. I don't know, Peter, I think it's probably far better in my view than maybe what you might get from trading house analysts. Would you have a view on that? I'm not trying to say one's better than the other, but you're looking at different things, aren't you?
I'm going to comment on the cost of the membership, because I think that's I reckon it's really cheap.
I do too. I do too.
It costs me about as much to fill up my car as it does to
There you go.
take out a year's memberships. So I reckon it's a bargain. In terms of comparing what we do to analysts or what analysts share, I see a very, very different kind of perspective. When I look at an analyst report, it's really about justifying their view on what the company's target price is for the next 12 months or whatever. And that's appropriate. It's a very valuable thing to look at. But I think ASA's perspective is more to do with the strategy of the organisation. Does it make sense going forward? Is the company responding to competition? Is it doing a lot of the things that will have that company around in the long term? And bear in mind the comment I made before about ASA shareholders are long-term shareholders. So there's a very good consistency there in terms of what we do.
Wonderful. Peter, we're just about out of time today. Look, I find discussing anything, every time I speak to people at the ASA, I learn. I never stop learning. And the one thing I'm always gracious, and I keep on telling my young kids, never stop learning, no matter how old you are. And I'm really pleased that you've going to come on the show and have a chat with me. It's really great. And Keith said you'd be good on the show, and you absolutely have been. Ladies and gentlemen, check out Australian Shareholders Association. I think the website is australianshareholders.com.au. I'm just looking at my screen. So have a look there. The voting intentions are obviously hidden behind the paywall. Join. Cost of a tank of petrol, if you are an active investor, I think it's a bargain. Peter, you've said it's a bargain as well. Peter, maybe when we get closer to reporting season, it'd be great to have you back on, maybe talk about what's pertinent at that point in time. But look, thanks so kindly for coming on Dollars and Making Sense.
Happy to, Ray. And if I can say, it's been my involvement with ASA has been an extraordinary and continuing learning experience that will go on for a long time.
Wonderful.
And thanks very much, Ray.
Wonderful to have you on this show. And until next time, thank you.